Candace Owens has one of the most popular political podcasts on the internet right now. Leaning heavily on pop culture news, she's mixed that with her Christian conservative perspective on the world. In the last year, she's had a huge rise in views, regularly getting over 1 million for each new broadcast. I wanted to take a look at what her show, Candace, is like. So I watched a mix of her most recent and most popular uploads from the time she went independent, a little less than a year ago, which happened in mid-2024. If you don't know who Candace Owens is, the very, very short version is she attempted to make a name for herself as a mainstream commentator before pivoting to the right. She was then discovered by Turning Points USA and has been climbing the ranks in right-wing media ever since. If you'd like a more thorough version of her story, I suggest checking out a recent episode of the podcast, Posting Through It, that goes into much greater detail about how she got to where she is. I've linked it below. Owens' podcast has a very casual feel to it. She describes it like she's talking to her friends on the phone.
I kind of am just like, hey, oh my gosh, did you see this? This is crazy. Oh, I just read this crazy book. Oh my gosh, what does this mean about our government? It's corrupt. It's like talking to my family on the phone.
This is a big part of her appeal. She has this very loose, friendly way of speaking, and it makes her feel very authentic, a huge plus in this space. She's also good at guiding her audience towards certain reactions, but she does it in a way that is deeply manipulative, because one of the things I noticed most about her show is that it's less about trying to analyze news stories and more about cultivating a way to feel about these stories. Here's an example of how she tries to undermine science.
I'm not a flat earther. I'm not a round earther. Actually, what I am is I am somebody who has left the cult of science. I have left the mega church of science, because what I have now realized is that science, what it is actually, if you think about it, is a pagan faith.
She then goes on to offer an example of how a woman who got an IUD later experienced some health complications. This is according to a tweet this person made. We don't know how much or if any of this tweet is true, but that doesn't matter because Owens isn't talking about thinking things through.
Having something that comes online inside, something spiritual, maybe as opposed to referring to it as your gut instinct, we should refer to it as the Holy Spirit. And so it takes you and goes, no, that actually makes no sense.
She then tries to present a rationale for this with a clip from Andrew Tate.
If you even look at data nowadays, you're a dumbass. You should just know. Street smart people don't need data. We've just been around. You know?
That is so relatable to me. I can't even explain it.
This whole segment is just about telling people to start trusting their gut.
Well, the moon landings definitely happened because this, and the firmament, and they could get, and I'm just like, no, I don't know. Instinctually, it just doesn't register to me. It just feels like that is a lie.
There's this great quote from Flannery O'Connor that the truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it emotionally. What Candace Owens is doing is trying to completely circumvent that idea, to rely more on how you feel about something rather than trying to think it through logically. At its most distilled form, that's what I think her show is about. But the way she builds off of that is she's also telling you how to feel about something. In general, she is guiding her audience towards certain feelings and certain vibes she wants from a story. And throughout the process, truth and facts get jettisoned to instead wholly embrace this vibe. As we go through her various videos, you'll notice her evidence and argumentation is always very lacking, but it's very rich in style. And I think this is how she's reaching people. And what's even more alarming is the direction she's trying to push people towards. Not just one that ignores scientific consensus, but one that reinforces a lot of ugly political opinions. One of the frustrating things about Candace Owens is she's often not very straightforward with what she says and believes, opting to use dog whistles. For instance, one of the things she's often been accused of is using anti-Jewish dog whistles. She has a very long history of doing this. One random example I chose from a little while back was when she was defending Kanye West after he threatened to go DEFCON 3 on Jewish people.
I had no idea when I read this tweet what the hell he was talking about. This tweet inspired questions, not answers. First and foremost, what is DEFCON 3? Did he mean DEFCON 3, which would be a military defense position, not an offense for those of you that are offended?
This is a great example of the deliberate obtuseness Owens uses in her commentary. Does she really think we need to read the tweet as literal for it to be hateful? Obviously, Kanye West is not a military or a government or anything like that. He's using a turn of phrase to express a negative sentiment towards Jewish people. But this is part of the game she plays, making reductive points and then hiding in the murky area of plausible deniability. Luckily for us, Kanye West gave us a clear understanding of where his head is at a short while after this tweet.
Every human being has something of value that they brought to the table, especially Hitler.
As for Candace Owens, part of her project is to muddy the waters so that hatred can only be understood when it is big and obvious.
This guy's really a racist. He's just like dropping N-bombs. Like, obviously, this person is extremely racist. But when you get to this sort of like, it was done in a way, you just know that it doesn't exist.
Owens needs people to believe this because otherwise they might notice a distressing pattern in much of her commentary, not just anti-Jewish dog whistles, but a greater goal of undermining a world that doesn't fit in her Christian conservative worldview, one that discriminates against minority groups, denies science, and condemns people to living in paranoid conspiracy theories. Before getting deep into this, I need to make an important point very clear, particularly as it relates to how Candace Owens speaks about Israel. She has made several statements in the past about Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. While I certainly think it's important and good to criticize Israel for its actions, her commentary is of a different stripe than most other critics of the country. Here's a quick example from a recent video where she's talking about the Trump administration broadening the label of anti-Semitism to silence criticism of Israel.
It is under the guise of fighting anti-Semitism on college campuses. Human Health Secretary RFK Jr. saying, oh, we have to declare this an epidemic. And what we're really talking about is people voicing opinions against Israel's policies on blowing up Palestinian kids.
So far, so good. Criticizing a country is not the same as criticizing a religious group. But here's the poison pill in her commentary.
To even suggest that a Jewish person might be more loyal to Israel than they are to America. That's totally plausible. It's totally plausible that a black person in America might be more loyal to Uganda than they are to America. Look at that. That is like, why are we redefining this?
We went from protecting criticism of Israel to protecting the accusation that a Jewish American is more loyal to Israel than America. That is, switching from the criticism of a country's actions to a random person because of their religious faith. This is why Candace Owens isn't an ally worth having in this moment. People like her make it easy to call out anti-genocide protesters as bigots on the one hand and legitimize her ridiculous web presence to the other. This isn't just true for her criticism of Israel when she starts talking about how we can't trust the CIA or other subjects that are traditionally criticized by the left. It often sounds pretty good, but much in the way Tucker Carlson's complaints about corruption at the highest level always ended up with demonizing immigrants and supporting Republican politicians, Candace Owens' criticism of these sides is similarly an ideological and practical dead end. There are people with better politics and no ridiculous conspiracy theories making much better critiques than her, and I hope people aren't being suckered into supporting Owens because it sounds like she might be useful. If you support her in any way, the only one being used is you, to bolster her audience or buy some kind of legitimacy in other spaces. Before getting into this, I do want to issue a content warning. There is going to be a lot of discussion about sexual assault, as you might have guessed, considering we're talking about Harvey Weinstein. One of the toughest sells for Candace Owens to her audience, or at least what I thought would be one of the toughest sells, was her series where she tries to argue that Harvey Weinstein, who was convicted of multiple sex crimes, is the victim of injustice. Harvey Weinstein became synonymous with the Me Too movement, which is a movement from a couple years back where women started to speak more openly about the sexual assaults and sexual harassment they received from powerful men. Harvey Weinstein was seen as something of a poster boy for this movement as he used his tremendous power and influence in Hollywood to coerce women into providing him with sexual favors. The evidence against him reported in the mainstream media was overwhelming, with over 100 women accusing him of sexual assault or harassment. We were awash in personal testimony from victims and colleagues. There were records of payments for non-disclosure agreements, and we even had a recording of Weinstein harassing someone.
Yesterday you touched my breast.
Oh, please, I'm sorry. Just come on. I'm used to that. Come on.
Are you used to that?
Yes, come in.
It's a wonder why Candace Owens would champion someone that seemed to have so much weight against them. In a February 27th video titled, "Breaking My First Prison Phone Call with Harvey Weinstein," she explains it wasn't just her curiosity that got her on board. In this clip, she's describing a conversation she had in 2022.
I was contacted by a third party to my shock and surprise, and they asked me if I would just take a look at the Harvey case and if I would maybe be interested in interviewing him.
This sequence of events was completely contradicted by Weinstein, who said in an interview with Page Six, "She approached a friend of mine, and then she approached me." Later, when Owens spoke to Weinstein in 2023, she presented it like this.
And then he says to me, "Why would I go with you?" And he tells me that he's speaking with 3 other people who want to do this interview, who have much better experience and a way further reach than I have, all things that are objectively true. He's making me pitch myself. Like I suddenly felt like I was trying out for the cheerleading team.
Going back to that Page Six interview, I tried to talk her out of it. Weinstein, 72, said of her defending him publicly, but I've never seen anything like it. The woman is going to be a superstar. I'm not entirely sure which of these 2 people are telling the truth. Possibly neither of them are. Regardless, this whole series from the get-go seems less a sober appraisal of the case and rather something birthed with the attempt to exonerate Harvey Weinstein and undermine the Me Too movement more broadly.
I've never changed my stance on the Me Too movement, and this is perhaps why this third-party individual sought me out.
We were promised that this series would be really explosive and include important revelations. But instead, what we got was little more than a rehashing of evidence that was litigated years ago, paying special attention to transcripts from the Weinstein trial. And they narrowly focus on the testimonies of 2 of Harvey Weinstein's accusers at his New York trial in 2020, in which he received a 23 years conviction after being found guilty of rape in the 3rd degree and a criminal sexual act in the 1st degree. This verdict has since been overturned on an appeal, and the whole trial is being done over again as I'm working on this video, this time with charges for a 3rd victim being added. Very briefly covered is the Los Angeles trial, where Weinstein was found guilty on 3 charges of rape, forced oral copulation, and 3rd-degree sexual misconduct, and sentenced to 16 years. There are also 8 civil lawsuits, though Owens doesn't really go into detail about those either. While these trials have a very narrow focus, there were obviously many more accusers who came forward who did not have their day in court. Owen mentions these public statements from these other victims, and she puts an odd spin to them.
They were able to sort through the women who were just outright lying, meaning women who had definitively never even slept with Harvey Weinstein, some women who he alleges he never even met, from the women who had, at the very least, been intimate with him, okay? I'll tell you why, because, of course, when people realize that someone's going down, if were a struggling person who wanted to make a quick buck and you knew that this empire was going to crash, you might be willing to come in for a quick payday.
It's a very mushy-mouth response saying that these other accusers are all liars or, at the very least, weren't credible enough to make it to trial. What it misses is how some of the accusations were well past the statute of limitations and couldn't go to trial. There's also the inherent difficulty in prosecuting cases of sexual assault. And in some cases, charges were being investigated and were being brought forward, but were all put on hold after Weinstein was convicted, such as the victim who was added to the 2025 trial. It's quite likely that if, for some reason, Weinstein is found not guilty in this current trial, the state of New York might have more charges for him forthcoming. And of course, he still has 16 years in the Los Angeles trial. So there may be charges in Los Angeles that are being downplayed or ignored because they simply don't seem necessary when he's basically got a life sentence. There were also special complications for this case, which explain why certain accusations never went to trial, such as the fact that Harvey Weinstein hired people to publicly smear accusers. That includes the case of Ambra Gutierrez, who was groped and propositioned by Weinstein. She went to the police, who then had her wear a wire, so when she encountered Weinstein, she got him to confess to his actions on tape.
Can I stay on the bar?
No, you must come here now.
Not today, maybe. No.
A little bit.
Please. No, I don't want to.
All right, we'll see. We'll see.
After Weinstein found out about the recording, Gutierrez was dragged through the tabloids, and she had her reputation tarnished. The district attorney's office declined to press charges, and according to a Frontline documentary, it was because questions arose regarding Gutierrez's past in Italy. And to my ears, these questions very much resemble the articles used to smear Gutierrez's reputation.
They were asking me questions like, are these news real? Like, you were a prostitute? I was asking them like, did you hear the recording? They were like, yes, I heard of it, but you have to explain this situation in Italy. It's very confusing. I was like, guys, I'm the victim.
Concerned how her story would play before a jury, the district attorney's office announced Weinstein would not be prosecuted.
Gutierrez broke a $1 million NDA to release the audio of Weinstein to the world. This was just one of many cases, though, as Weinstein also hired people to more directly damage those making claims against him, such as hiring a former spy who gathered information on accusers, then used that information to threaten them into silence.
Go through the list and try and find out who is saying negative things, because he wants a heads up as to what he thinks is going on.
And this guy is just one of several former intelligence officers from Black Cube who were employed by Weinstein. Candace Owens included none of this information in her video series. Instead, her coverage focused entirely on the testimonies of Miriam Haley and Jessica Mann, the victims whose stories led to the 2020 New York conviction. The first two videos are primarily about the Haley testimony, trying to pull out moments that undermine her story. Here's an example from an incident where Weinstein forced his way into Haley's apartment. Here's how Owens described it.
There was also a second security door that you would have to be buzzed into. And she's not really sure how he doesn't really remember the details of how he got past that one, but he did. And then we learned that the layout of that apartment actually required him to go right and then left in order to get to her open door.
The testimony included details of how he got in. Weinstein was outside her building and refusing to leave, so she decided to confront him in person, thinking he would go away. This was before he assaulted her, by the way. When she went to confront him, she had left the security door open because she hadn't brought her keys. He pushed his way past her, walked through the open security door, and was able to locate Haley's first floor apartment because she had pointed out to where it was when he had dropped her off earlier in the day. This isn't difficult to figure out, but Candace Owens reads all of it as if it's some kind of mystery to create the impression that Haley is lying or her story just doesn't make any sense, when it's all very easy to understand. Here's another example. Owens is describing how, after Haley was first propositioned by Weinstein, she then got a job working on one of his shows, Project Runway. This is her summary of the testimony.
It's an interesting testimony there. Yeah, she needed a job and kind of has to admit, maybe she got his number on the way out of that horrible massage incident in which she cried, and then maybe she reached out to his office about that position, which wasn't really an open position, but required someone with power to kind of make the position for a person who isn't supposed to be working in the U.S. just kind of happen. I don't know. I'm not alleging anything, okay?
She knows exactly what she's doing here by summarizing things with long gaps as a way of casting doubt without actually providing any new facts. She's clearly trying to suggest that this testimony is suspicious and alleging that Haley is lying. She does this a lot. She reads things, kinda comes close to drawing a conclusion, but leaves it in the mind of the watcher to fill in the gap. That way there's an element of plausible deniability where she can say she didn't actually allege anything. She just brought everyone up to that position and then moved forward because everyone's making those mental leaps themselves.
Mila says, I have worked in the industry for 15 years and have seen many women throw themselves onto the casting couch for that leading role. They are not innocent. Oh, shocking. Do you think that's what happened with Mimi? No, what? Maybe you need to go back and watch her cry some more.
But you'll notice that as she went through that testimony, she didn't actually find any evidence of that. If anything, Haley is refusing Weinstein and then trying to get the job that was discussed at the meeting without having to do any sort of personal favors for him. And I also can't stress this enough. Nothing she's reading in these segments is new information. And the one place where they absolutely heard all of this was in the courtroom, because this is where it all came from. Much of Owens's other comments echo a lot of myths about sexual assault, in particular raising questions as to why Haley did or did not do certain things, as if victims of sexual assault are required to behave a certain way, and if they don't, they can't be considered credible. As an example, after Haley is assaulted, her behavior is considered suspicious because she wrote little hearts in a calendar a few days afterwards.
She's drawing hearts in her calendar. It doesn't seem to be, she's testified earlier that she draws hearts and stuff to demonstrate her mood. She doesn't seem to be in the mood, I think is what Damon is implying here, of someone who just survived a horrific assault.
Not only does this ignore that she wrote those hearts after her friend gave birth to a child that Haley would be the godmother to, but it suggests that victims of sexual assault aren't allowed to be in a good mood in the days that follow. It also assumes that anytime someone draws hearts on their calendar, it must be because they feel good, and they must feel good in that specific day. It's really a sign of the desperation Owens has if she's reduced to presenting things like this as if they're meaningful pieces of evidence. Owens also presents Haley meeting Weinstein again after she was assaulted the first time, only to be assaulted again, is apparently very suspicious. Again, to suggest this was some kind of consensual relationship and not, as Haley said, she was trying to confront someone and regain some kind of personal power. She was also assuming that this invitation to talk was in a public area, only to find out later that it wasn't. Even if that sounds silly to Candace Owens' ears, it isn't much evidence of a consensual relationship. Also, it's worth remembering that this is a woman living in America who isn't even legally able to work anywhere, and her one source of employment and the only income she's made so far is from Weinstein. So the power dynamics, I hope, are clear here. Owens also pulls up emails Haley sent after the two assaults where she's trying to find work. These messages, by the way, aren't being sent directly to Weinstein. Rather, they are going through his assistant.
And your support is very much appreciated. Lots of love, Miriam. Lots of love. Lots of love, guys.
To me, these emails read more as sad than anything else. Many of these messages were sent well after she had returned to England and were part of many messages she had sent to other people she had worked with in order to find more work. They're clearly representing a woman who needs work and is willing to reach out to anyone to make that happen. But an example of the extremes Candace Owens will go to in order to present this woman in a negative light, here is her responding to a comment about someone's observation of one of the messages.
Many of you guys pointed out that that email looked very sexual because she says my kitty needs feeding or my cat needs feeding. You know, I'd really appreciate any lead. She's asking for a job, and she ends it by saying my cat needs feeding.
As someone who has gotten weird comments under my videos in the past, you don't have to read the most ridiculous ones as if they have any credibility. To consider the phrase, my cat needs feeding, as something sexual is deeply bizarre and honestly a little unhinged. But Candace Owens is willing to give credence to any sort of claim so long as it helps her undermine the credibility of a victim of sexual assault. Owens also pretends as if Haley's testimony is the only evidence that was presented regarding her specific case.
And she decides to present this story as her having been sexually assaulted. And she was successful. Like I said, she broke down crying on the stand. And that was enough in New York to give him 20 years.
In addition to Haley's testimony, a friend and roommate she had at the time also testified that Haley told her about the assault when it happened back in 2006. Part of her testimony about Haley after the incident was quoted as, she was much more withdrawn, more nervous, significantly less vital, spent a lot of time in her room. Also part of the trial was the testimony of a forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Barbara Ziv, who speaks directly to complaints that Candace Owens made. The reasons are complex, Ziv said. Why women continue to have contact with the perpetrator include the fact that, as devastating as sexual assault is, most individuals think, I can put it behind me and move on with my life and put it in a box. I don't want it to get worse. I don't want this individual who sexually assaulted me to ruin my reputation, to tell people, to ruin my job opportunities. I can handle this physical trauma, but God forbid they ruin the rest of my life. There is always a worry of the victim that the perpetrator can ruin their life, Ziv said, adding that this concern can scare victims, even more profoundly than being sexually assaulted. When women know the perpetrator, which is typically the case, the victims frequently do not leave and they stay for a long period of time, partly because they're hoping to resume their former relationship with the rapist, in denial that the attack happened. They can't really believe that this has happened to them. They're hoping that this is just an aberration, Ziv said. The victim will tell themselves, yes, they did this horrible thing, but look at all these other really good things that they've done. The other testimony Owens focuses on is Jessica Mann's. Unlike Haley, Mann at one point did have a consensual relationship with Weinstein, though it was non-sexual until Weinstein assaulted her. Owens' questions about Mann's story again center around her behavior. Like after the day she alleges she was raped, she reached out to someone who worked for Weinstein to set her up with a driver from the airport. To clarify, she was assaulted in New York, flew to LA, and was trying to find a way to get back home.
I feel like if I had survived a rape, I would not want to then be subjected unnecessarily to being in the car with the drivers of the person who had raped me.
Yes, that common hypothetical where, if you've been sexually assaulted, would you be willing to get in a car driven by someone who works for the guy that assaulted you the next day in a completely different city? Owens' incredulity towards this isn't evidence of anything, but it's how she frames neutral evidence, using any gap in logic she can invent to suggest someone is lying. She then goes on to read several emails that show the two were in a consensual relationship, as if sexual assault can happen within a consensual relationship. At one point, Mann had a breakdown during her testimony when she was being questioned about the assault, and Owens, without any evidence, suggests her crying and eventual scream were all part of an act.
When you can't really answer basic questions, you just scream and cry, shake uncontrollably, say you need a break, say you need water. It's almost like someone is like coaxing them to do that. Like someone is training them, like this is what you should do in this circumstance. If you get asked a tough question and you don't think you're going to win this thing, you gotta have some lady feelings. I'm just saying.
This is the sort of hollow speculation that is used to undermine women's testimonies when they're victims of sexual assault, and it can be spun in either direction. If Mann hadn't been emotional during her testimony, one could speculate about whether or not it's true because she doesn't seem very emotional about it. And obviously, when she did get emotional, it was considered too much and over the top, like it was all an act. This is the problem with this kind of speculation that Candace Owens is doing, especially when it works backwards from someone trying to undermine public accusations of sexual assault. It's a lose-lose situation for any victim who testifies. Owens seems to think that the only reason the jury was convinced was because these women cried while on the stand.
In the courtroom, this is the moment where she trembles and she weeps and she puts her hands in her head. Because if you're thinking about asking questions about that or wondering if there's an aspect of common sense here, maybe don't go back to a hotel room, don't let him into your apartment, anything like that. The point is now she's crying on the stand. And crying counts for a lot on the stand. You're going to learn that a lot throughout this case.
This is very similar to something Weinstein's lawyer, Donna Rotano, said.
I think the problem in a case like this up to this point is the fact that the emotion of this case has been taken over and common sense has been left outside.
Here's Owens talking about Mann again.
There are a lot of emails. Just take a look at this scroll. Hundreds upon hundreds of emails between Harvey and Jessica Mann. They do nothing to dispel the idea, is what I will say, of a very consensual relationship that spanned for 5 years.
And a comment quoted in a CNN article. This is not about a young individual who was tricked by a master manipulator, Weinstein attorney Damon Chironis said in opening statements about Mann. You will see, get ready for it, an actual loving relationship in hundreds of emails and communications between Harvey Weinstein and Jessica Mann. Much of what Owens says is more or less repeating the claims and allegations made by Weinstein's defense team. If anything, Owens' reporting on this doesn't just read as biased. It reads like an extension of that defense strategy. Owens does claim that she isn't getting paid, though.
I'm not being paid by Harvey's team. Harvey's team isn't asking me to do anything. Harvey didn't even want me to do this because Harvey's still on the left. Think about that. I had to essentially try out to even be able to present this.
Aside from the testimony of the two victims, the only other testimonies that Owens mentions were the other women who testified to establish Weinstein's pattern of behavior. These testimonies in particular are important because it was decided that they were not admissible in a 2024 verdict, and that's the reason the trial is being redone. I don't know enough about the law to say whether or not the decision of a retrial was just, but the ruling was a 4-3 decision from a panel of judges weighing in on the issue. So it doesn't seem like it's as clear-cut as Candace Owens suggests. Owens also brings up how the judge from the 2020 New York case was not reappointed to his position in 2022, saying that it was because of how he handled the trial.
He was so corrupt that the mayor's office denied to reappoint him to the bench due to this perceived corruption that was stemming from this trial.
This speculation is weirdly irresponsible because it actually undermines what Owens is trying to do. According to a report from the New York Law Journal, Judge Burke was not reappointed because of his judicial temperament, and that he was too confrontational and discourteous, according to one source. The city, an outlet covering New York City, alleges that the removal of Judge Burke was because of a connection Weinstein's lawyer had with City Hall. Considering how Weinstein is having his whole trial redone, it seems as though he is not some victim of a hostile justice system, but a rather very rich, powerful man who is able to get access to justice that the average person certainly wouldn't. There was an unusually long delay between the 3rd and 4th episode, so much so that I'm actually writing this bit of the script after I started editing this video. Originally, the 4th episode in this Harvey Speaks series was going to air the day after the 3rd, at least according to Candace Owens.
Don't worry, tomorrow we're still going to unpack her allegations and go through her testimony and the overwhelming evidence that she was very content in whatever their relationship was via the emails, which we'll get into tomorrow, like I said.
It turns out tomorrow meant 2 months later, and instead of a full episode on the LA trial, we instead get half the episode dedicated to recapping the New York trial, and the second half is dedicated to the Los Angeles trial, specifically highlighting the testimony of Weinstein's accuser, Evgenia Chernyshova. Candace Owens more or less suggests that this encounter between her and Weinstein never happened.
Not a single shred of evidence that Harvey was even there. Think about that he was even there. And they convicted him. It's because she cried in court. That's just completely crazy. And they say women have no power.
It might be interesting to try looking into why the jury found this testimony so compelling, and it completely flies in the face of Candace Owens' speculation. Speculation that sounds very much like Weinstein's defense team, by the way, alleging that emotional displays swung the jury. Here's an excerpt from an AP article that interviewed several jurors. While tearful at times, Jane Doe 1's testimony was restrained and straightforward in comparison to some that followed. She spoke slowly with a Russian accent and made nearly no use of a translator on hand. Juror Arnold Esqueda said that the intensely emotional testimony of Sibyl Newsom, who was screaming through tears at times during her testimony, might have been too much for some fellow jurors. The panel was divided 6-6 on the counts involving her when he suggested getting a readback of her testimony from the court reporter. After the readback, minus the emotions, a few people moved in favor of the case, but not enough for a conviction. The jury ruled 10-2 and 8-4 in favor of finding Weinstein guilty for the other 2 women who testified, but those are obviously short of the unanimous verdict that went to the testimony that eventually convicted Weinstein. Some facts that might have convinced the jury was that Chernyshova was able to describe Weinstein's genitals as being abnormal to police, well before this had become public knowledge in the New York trial. Candace Owens tries to argue that this couldn't have been the case since at one point she described having to, and I have to say it this way, suck Weinstein's balls, even though they had been surgically removed, which suggests she had no idea that that was the case. But Chernyshova explained that she had told police about his abnormal scrotum, saying it was like empty skin, which would be in line with the surgery that was done on them. Owens also never brings up how Chernyshova's daughter corroborated her mother's story. She testified that she and her mother saw Weinstein at a film festival in early 2017, and Chernyshova was terrified of him. This was before any of the accusations against Weinstein were made public. Sometime later, but still before the public revelations about Weinstein, Chernyshova would tell her daughter that she had been raped, empathizing with her daughter who had just gone through something similar in a way to encourage her to go to police. Although Chernyshova at first kept her attacker's identity private from her daughter, she would eventually reveal it to her, and when Weinstein was publicly accused in October of 2017, Chernyshova's daughter was able to identify him as the man who terrified her mother earlier that year at that festival. This is one of the witnesses in the LA trial who Owens never really addresses. When Owens gets to any other kinds of witnesses, she reduces it to people having bad stories about Weinstein.
Why did you allow witnesses to testify to his character, which had nothing to do with the case? You let people sit down and say, oh, he was really mean to me in 3rd grade. I'm being hyperbolic here, but they did allow people to testify. He was mean to his brother.
Many of these witnesses were women who accused him of assaulting them and friends who supported the claims of accusers who mentioned the assault to them at the time. To ignore all of this and to simply call it bad stories about Weinstein or something like that seems like a deliberate way to mislead your audience, or as Candace Owens might put it,
when you give people just little tidbits and you don't present the full picture, it can lead them to the wrong conclusions.
The major exclusive interview Candace Owens has with Harvey Weinstein is more PR than journalism. Here's an example of how she asks him questions.
You're very honest. Every time I ask you a question about any actress, you tell me exactly what happened. And it's interesting because what you're speaking about was what I always found to be problematic about the Me Too movement from the beginning, is we're conflating, he made a pass at me and I didn't like it, right? Or, I turned him down, or maybe I had a bad date with someone, with rape.
Started a question with how honest Weinstein is, and then complaining about women conflating being hit on with being raped. Though it is a little bit funny seeing Weinstein trying to steer this interview away from any conversation about the legal cases.
I can't talk about the case.
Yeah.
I can just, talk to you about the things that you need to talk to me about.
Right. And I totally understand that. I'm not going to push you on that.
I don't understand what the point of this interview is if not to talk about the cases Candace Owens has supposedly been investigating. Either she's going to get some answers for him or she's just going to let him say whatever he wants to rehabilitate his image. This interview isn't journalism. It's just PR to make Weinstein look better. To be completely fair, though, I've only watched the free sample on Owens' channel because, of course, the full interview costs $5. Based on some of the summaries I've read of it online, it doesn't seem as though there was any particularly explosive revelations, and it's quite clear that Weinstein was not going to be talking about any of the cases against him. And before leaving this section entirely, there's one last thing I wanted to talk about. Candace Owens actually came up during the 2025 Weinstein trial in New York. Here's how it was written about in The Hollywood Reporter. At one point this week, the defense team raised the possibility of bringing in Owens as a witness, alleging that she had communications with Mann regarding whether she had viewed the encounter with Weinstein as rape. Aidala, that's Weinstein's lawyer, has asked Mann about this conversation in cross-examination, implying that she had said she did not consider it rape. But it was later stricken from the record and jurors received instructions to disregard the questioning as it was without factual basis. Anyone familiar with Candace Owens' show is aware that Jessica Mann was actually in touch with her over Instagram, at one point saying she was willing to discuss her story publicly with Owens. But according to Owens, talks for a public interview broke down and Mann did not make an appearance on her show. No other part of this conversation that I could see was ever made public. It's interesting how the defense for Harvey Weinstein claims to have knowledge of any kind of conversation between Owens and Mann, almost as if they're being fed information. This, coupled with the timing of this series, airing right before the retrial, and Candace Owens' arguments more or less parroting the defense and her gentle interview with Weinstein, I think clearly contradicts any attempt to present this whole endeavor as journalism. It's almost certainly part of a PR campaign. Ones that seem quite similar to tactics Weinstein has used in the past to discredit the women who have made accusations against him. I don't know if Candace Owens knows or cares that she's being used in this way, and ultimately, it doesn't really matter. And just before I publish this video, we got a result for the second New York Harvey Weinstein trial. Another jury once again found him guilty for the sexual assault on Miriam Haley. He was acquitted on the new charges from the most recent accuser, and the Jessica Mann verdict ended in a mistrial, meaning that this specific charge might be going back to court for a third time. As I write this, Candace Owens is on maternity leave, so we'll have to wait to hear what she has to say about it. It might be interesting to hear how Candace Owens spins Weinstein being found guilty once more on the Haley case, which is the one she spent the most time trying to discredit. But I suspect if she mentions it at all, she'll try to play it off as the jury not being trustworthy. And if she were consistent, she'd have to point out that this would have to hold true for the acquittal as well, but I suspect it's really just the guilty charge she's going to think is unjust. But hey, maybe she'll come to the same conclusion 3 different juries have now come to, that Harvey Weinstein is a sexual predator. Probably not going to happen, but hey, I like surprises. One of the most ridiculous special series Candace Owens has produced was the 8 videos on Brigitte Macron secretly being trans, a claim that rests pretty much exclusively on the evidence of how she kind of looks like the boy in this picture. The boy in this picture is Jean-Michel Tournon, her brother. Yes, this entire controversy rests on the idea that a woman looks like her brother and therefore must be trans. But I just jumped ahead to the big reveal at the end of the series. There was a voluminous amount of setup to this, filled with a mix of real stories and paranoid fantasies. Before we really get into this, as a content warning for my French viewers, you are probably already scandalized by my pronunciation of French names. In my defense, though, here's how Candace Owens discusses French names.
A son who has Marie in his name as well. His name is John Claude Marie Joseph Trogneau. That's a lot of names.
This particular theory was actually floated by Candace Owens in a video right before she left the Daily Wire, but she decided to carry on with this narrative when she went independent. Any viewers from France might be more familiar with this story, though, as this particular theory has been bouncing around for years, although it isn't taken very seriously aside from a few dedicated theorists. One thing I'd like you to keep in mind while we go through this is that Candace Owens has staked a lot on this story.
I would stake my entire professional career on the fact that Brigitte Macron, the current First Lady of France, was born a man,
Okay, I should clarify, a lot in this context means a lot of money rather than a lot of credibility. What's particularly striking about this story is how pointless all of it is. Candace Owens tries to make us very concerned about what's happening in France with stories about the opening ceremony at the Olympics being satanic, or that Brigitte Macron wanted to put a giant penis on the renovated Notre Dame Cathedral. Neither of those stories is true, but they do a great job of avoiding actual issues surrounding the French government to instead focus on this idea that Satanists have taken over France. If the worst thing Owens can point out to is them putting a giant penis on Notre Dame, I'm not sure we really have to worry about the Satanists. When Candace Owens actually gets to something real, it's the suspicious age gap between Emmanuel Macron and Brigitte.
That was one of many first red flags for me. A 14-year-old boy and a 39-year-old woman?
The two met when Emmanuel Macron was still a teenager. The story is that nothing happened between them until he was of legal age to be in an adult relationship. But they almost certainly knew each other for years before that allegedly happened. It's hard to know what exactly happened between the two of them because they were both private citizens at the time. But even if something did happen, all it means is that Emmanuel was the victim of an older woman preying upon a teenage student. Owens moves this story along by pointing out that when Emmanuel Macron stepped into the spotlight, this relationship was covered with a flurry of positive stories with titles like Brigitte and Emmanuel Macron, from impossible love to presidential couple. Probably sounds a little nicer in French, but I'm not going to do that to everyone here. This is an obvious sign of a PR campaign to make their highly irregular and quite possibly predatory relationship seem like a fairy tale. In this part of the series of videos, we've got something real here. And had it been an investigation into the relationship between these two and if anything illegal was happening and how the media was being used to silence those questions, it would be a surprisingly decent bit of commentary. But Candace Owens decided to take it much further to the point where it loses the thread of reality. Ahead of the series, Candace Owens sent a list of questions to the Macrons, demanding answers and offering to sit down with them for an interview. Apparently unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, that the president of France is pretty busy and likely doesn't have time to sit down with a random YouTube creator to talk about how his wife is actually a woman. As you might have guessed, these questions went unanswered, which Owens mentions several times in multiple videos. Apparently not answering these questions is evidence of them having something to hide. For those unfamiliar with how conspiracy theories work, a common tactic used is that when people are the subject of one, they never engage directly. There are many good reasons not to do that, such as it giving the theory the illusion of credibility or giving it the opportunity to spread even further. But throughout this series, Candace Owens demonstrates one of the clearest reasons these theories persist, because none of these questions are being asked in good faith. Owens is constantly saying that all she needs is a clear answer to these questions, and that would solve everything.
But they simply were not anguished enough or could not muster the energy to answer 21 basic questions to put an end to the scandal.
This isn't entirely the case, as we'll eventually see, but this is what Candace Owens first introduces as part of the series because so much of it rests on speculation about a supposedly suspicious lack of evidence, and when evidence is presented, it can never be trusted. For instance, she makes frequent references to the lack of photographs of Brigitte at various points in her life.
We don't have school photos of the First Lady. We can't get our hands on it.
A lot of Owens' argument rests on this idea that there are very few photos of Brigitte publicly available, and that the only ones we have come from a PR firm. This makes sense for the wife of the president, whose life has largely been spent as a private citizen, especially someone who is in her 70s and obviously could not have spent her younger years on social media. But the fact that there are no pictures of her as a young girl is considered deeply suspicious. Except we do have a few photos that were made available to the public of Brigitte as a young girl, but apparently these photos aren't good enough.
Virginie Linhart did, however, receive 2 photos from Brigitte's alleged childhood.
When Candace Owens first discussed the image of Brigitte as a young girl, she speculated it was doctored. She would backtrack on this afterwards, but her response is part of the problem. She tries to frame her questions as simple and easy to answer, and the lack of an answer is evidence. But when evidence to the contrary is presented, like clear photos of Brigitte Macron as a young girl, that evidence is immediately treated as suspicious, and its validity needs to be proven even further. Even after Candace Owens concedes that the photo was not recolored, she then starts speculating it may be of Brigitte's daughter instead. And then she pivots back to her questions not being answered.
Why not just say plainly, if you're going to write a legal letter, Candace, the person in this community photo is not Tifone Ozier, and the photo is not recolorized. And it is, in fact, First Lady Brigitte Macron. They don't do that. They never do that.
It's a ridiculous question to ask because they already said the photo is of Brigitte. That was why they released the photo in the first place. But you can see how this is becoming a game of whack-a-mole, with Candace Owens pivoting from any answer she gets to change the question. It's a classic move of conspiracy theorists because their questions are designed to elicit specific answers. And when they don't get those answers, they undermine the evidence and reword the questions, saying whatever they need to in order to defend the theory. And often they'll just make up something random to be suspicious about. Here's how Candace Owens describes Brigitte Macron suspiciously wearing a scarf.
She seems strangely to be wearing a scarf in a lot of these authorized photos. Why was she always covering her neck? That's kind of weird.
Why is this suspicious? Is it because she might have an Adam's apple? Because we can see in the other photos from the time period she clearly doesn't. She just likes wearing scarves. One of the funnier parts of this whole photo investigation is when Candace Owens starts showing these images to a piece of software that uses AI facial recognition, as if using this software to compare photos of young Brigitte and old Brigitte should be taken very seriously.
We now live in an age of plastic surgery, right? Women can literally change their faces. And the fact that this technology is still able to process who that person is amazing to me.
As a skeptical man myself, I decided to double-check the photos Owens showed us in that video, and I can confirm that, in fact, the results do correspond to what she shows us. But part of me wanted to see if I could undermine this tool, so I decided to do a random test where I compared a photo of young Candace Owens that she had shared on social media to a current picture of her, and I confirmed that yes, they are the same person. But what was more interesting was that when I was swapping around the photos of Brigitte and Candace, I got this result. According to this AI facial recognition software, the picture of young Brigitte and young Candace are the same person at a high probability. So maybe this facial recognition software isn't that trustworthy, or maybe, and I'm just asking a question here, maybe Candace Owens is trying to hide the real truth that perhaps she's secretly Brigitte. Maybe the reason they can't sit down for an interview is because they are, in fact, the same person. And maybe the fact that they've never been photographed together is deeply suspicious. And maybe it's easy to ask noodle brain questions about not having certain kinds of evidence than to actually find that evidence. Believe it or not, I've just gone over the most substantial evidence of Brigitte Macron being trans that these videos present. They definitely say a lot more, but I think there's an important point that needs to be made right here. The burden of proof of her claim always rests on the person making it. If you believe Brigitte Macron is trans, you need to provide evidence of that. Pointing to gaps in information is not evidence of anything other than information you don't have access to. The onus here isn't on Brigitte Macron to prove she was a cisgender woman. It's on the person saying she was assigned male at birth. This entire series is a long exercise in trying to reverse that burden of proof because Candace Owens can't substantiate her claims because she has no evidence. One of the wackier bits is Candace Owens presenting an interview with a trans woman named Véronique in the 1970s, and that this is supposedly Brigitte. I'm not sure why Brigitte would have to assume the name Véronique here, but it's likely because this is another example of working backwards from a conclusion. Naturally, we can't see this woman's face. Apparently, the speech patterns of Véronique are very similar to Brigitte because she uses the turn of phrase, that is to say.
Right? That is to say. Some people might say, like. You know, like I was going to like the store and like her tick is, that is to say, that is to say.
I'm not a native French speaker, but this particular verbal tick doesn't sound terribly unique. And the example of like Owen uses could be given to millions of people, so this doesn't actually narrow down anything. But she kind of has more. Véronique referenced Chopin and the poets Rimbaud and Verlaine. And did you know that Emmanuel Macron likes to play Chopin on the piano? And the French government considered inducting Rimbaud and Verlaine into a special pantheon for French artists while Macron was the president.
So that's just incredibly fascinating, right? It's incredibly fascinating that you have this person, Véronique, and she's saying and mentioning all the people that we know have this significance in their relationship between Emmanuel Macron and Brigitte.
Why is this fascinating? Chopin is a very famous composer, and Rimbaud and Verlaine are well-known poets. The fact that a trans woman mentioned them in an interview in the 1970s, and at some point the president of France can be tenuously connected to them, is somehow evidence that his wife is trans? These are the jumps in logic that are meant to provide links. But our time with Veronique doesn't end here because it turns out, and this is meant to be deeply suspicious, Brigitte's brother, Jean-Michel, actually married a woman named Veronique.
Could it be possible that Jean-Michel took on the name of a dear friend named Veronique who he was living with and who he then moved to marry? We don't know because, of course, there are no pictures of this wedding. There's nothing there.
We, of course, are not being shown any evidence that Jean-Michel and Veronique are the same person, just that there are two women who have the same name who have no demonstrable connection to one another. This is going to keep getting weirder. Xavier Poussard, whose work this series is largely based on, actually spoke to the Veronique who was formerly married to Jean-Michel, and she tells him he's got everything wrong.
Listen, sir, I have remarried and my children are here. I don't want any problems, but I can tell you that Jean-Michel is not Brigitte. That's ridiculous.
A direct answer from someone who would know, answering the question. That should be enough, right? Remember how Candace Owens said that was all she wanted, someone to give them a straight answer. Except, of course, this isn't enough. It was never going to be enough because why would you take a straight answer to a question when you can instead look at ambiguous evidence that could be used to color the whole conversation?
I didn't know Emmanuel Macron. We lived in Toulon. I didn't even know him. I saw him at my daughter's wedding, the first time I had ever seen him. Then I can hear another person on the line. Veronique Drew stops, visibly embarrassed, as if she's gone too far. She pulls herself together and asks me, "Well, and what is your name?" End of conversation.
Someone else being in the room during a phone call is not evidence of anything. You don't know who they were, we aren't told what they might have said, and the conversation ends with no resolution. But that's just enough ambiguity to cast suspicion on the whole thing. It's not actual evidence of anything, of course, just a vague detail someone can present with a shocked voice as if it's somehow very suspicious. It's laughably easy to do the same thing in reverse. For instance, with this bit here.
Veronique Drew stops, visibly embarrassed, as if she's gone too far.
How can someone be visibly embarrassed on a phone call? If I were a disingenuous person, I could suggest this phone call never happened, or say that this turn of phrase is deeply suspicious, while playing a video of a blue jay looking deeply skeptical about all of it. But more likely, the author thought he heard something in Veronique's voice that sounded like embarrassment, or maybe something got lost in translation. Candace Owens doesn't seriously entertain more likely possibilities like that because she's working towards a specific conclusion. And that conclusion is that Veronique was married to Jean-Michel, who had transitioned to someone named Veronique before changing their name to Brigitte. But also, when they signed the marriage certificate, they signed it as Jean-Michel. Also, when Jean-Michel transitioned, he used the same name as his sister. And then, just to build on this as if it's not already completely ridiculous, the child Jean-Michel and Veronique had is secretly Emmanuel Macron. The evidence for that is this photo.
It's really hard to convince me that these two people are not related, but they're not, guys, not according to the official legend.
I admit these two guys do look pretty similar, though it seems obvious to me that they aren't identical. If you look really closely, you can see their teeth are a little different, their wrinkles aren't quite the same, but yeah, they do look pretty similar. I remember when I was watching the movie Once Upon a Time in Mexico, where Willem Dafoe was cast to play a Mexican drug lord, and he had to have a body double. One of the fun bits of trivia about this is that they had hired a guy to be the body double, but it turns out a random guy who was working on the movie looked more like Dafoe than the actor they hired, so they just gave the job to this guy instead. Sometimes people just look like other people. But to Candace Owens, the more likely scenario, I guess, is that someone transitioned, changed their name to match their eventual spouse, then changed their name again to match their sister, and then raised a child to have two different identities, complete with fake parents, and then they married their own son. Or maybe two guys just look similar. I'll leave it to the audience to determine which of those two possibilities is more likely, though. Excuse me, though, Candace Owens is only asking questions here.
Is there a chance that Brigitte Macron, some of you asked, is actually the father of Emmanuel Macron? Now, to be clear, I had never made that statement because I wanted to keep this series factual. But there is obviously a lot going on here, a lot of evidence which suggests and points to the conclusion that the secret seems to be bigger than just having a transgendered wife.
Candace Owens is leading her audience to reach a specific conclusion without going there herself to create a level of plausible deniability. She will present the most outlandish statements and then walk them back. In the same video, we see her read a comment from a viewer.
Yes, I agree with those of you that are commenting right now that we are looking potentially at incest.
It's not a coincidence that people are being led to this conclusion, because this commentary is designed to reach that conclusion. And then when our audience reaches that conclusion, she's happy to affirm it. A classic conspiracy theory tactic of just asking questions and then acting as though it's mighty suspicious that no one has answered them yet. Or if they haven't answered them the right way. Or if there are photos suggesting otherwise, suggesting they might be doctored. Or if there's video evidence that Jean-Michel is still very much alive and living as a man and was in fact in the same place at the same time as Brigitte, well, that doesn't count either.
It's amazing that the Élysée Palace, rather than giving us a document, a passport with things blacked out, but maybe just his name, a driver's license, anything that would be a form of ID, photos of them together growing up, because this is our problem, is sending me screenshots of an inauguration with the guy in the background. Aha, it's debunked.
This video evidence actually came from Macron's lawyer, but apparently these videos don't count because Candace Owens needs to see some ID, and the Macrons need to agree to an interview.
We would like to provide them with the opportunity to present their stories and to clear up any rumors in the press. As such, we offer any date and time during the months of January, February, and March of 2025 for an interview between Candace and your client.
She later did some analysis of the video to show that Jean-Michel was standing in the wrong area, and Emmanuel Macron didn't even greet him appropriately.
I feel like if I was in the presence of my brother-in-law, I'd feel like I must go up to him first, right? Like I better go up to him first. And then Emmanuel's like, oh, okay, I have to say something a little friendly, goodbye, and that's it.
Video evidence of Jean-Michel and Brigitte in the same place at the same time should be enough to put this to bed, but it will never be enough until the answers she's given match the conclusion Candace Owens has already decided is true. But we still haven't reached the bottom of this conspiracy because, like all classic conspiracy theories, this one ends up in very familiar territory.
It was the Rothschild family, the Rothschild bank, that had everything to do with his professional resume.
Emmanuel Macron's ties to the financial industry are well known, and he indeed worked as an investment banker at Rothschild & Company. But Candace Owens' commentary isn't about the dangerous connection between the financial sector and the government. She centers it on the Rothschild family in particular. This family has been at the heart of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories for years, and it's impossible not to hear some of those theories echoing in Owens' words.
When you think about these globalists who I believe want to turn us into sort of these technological slaves.
This could be coming out of the mouth of Alex Jones, and it reveals the rot at the center of a certain type of conspiracy theorist. They keep digging deeper and eventually hit this core of anti-Semitism. And this one about Brigitte Macron is no different. Obviously, I couldn't touch on every link Candace Owens presents in these videos. Otherwise, this response would be 10 hours long. But anyone who's watched them might be wondering why I didn't bring up this or that point that you thought was genuinely impressive or at least suspicious. And honestly, if you think that it's suspicious that Emmanuel Macron's parents are both doctors, or that his mother allegedly once helped a trans patient of hers fill out some administrative forms, or that a blurry photo of Brigitte's sister kinda looks like Brigitte, then I would urge greater skepticism and more careful consideration of what you're being presented. Part of what makes these videos seem so compelling is the sheer volume of stuff being thrown at you. It's the classic conspiracy theory technique of the Gish Gallop, where lots of garbage is thrown out there and all labeled as evidence. But none of it is actually explored with any depth. It's usually a vague link that kind of sounds like it could be something, but before you have a chance to really think about it or engage with it, the next thing is brought up in a machine gun fire. It creates this large body of what sounds like evidence, but really falls apart when you examine it more closely. It may be a compelling narrative, but once that narrative comes into contact with reality, it falls apart very quickly. That's why evidence to the contrary has to be endlessly re-examined and undermined, and questions need to be reframed over minor language quibbles, because theories like these thrive on gaps of information and a very superficial understanding of the facts. What's probably most frustrating about all of this is that there is ample ground to criticize Emmanuel Macron. Candace Owens never really touches on that, instead preferring to talk about how he put a weird book on his desk in an official photo, or that his wife is friends with a fashion designer who hires trans models. These hidden messages and random associations matter far less than his actions as the president of France. If Candace Owens really wanted to cast a critical eye at Macron's time at the Rothschild Bank, She might have mentioned how he undervalued his assets by hundreds of thousands of euros to avoid paying taxes, or how the millions he earned never seemed to make it into his net worth, or how one of the first things Macron did when he became president was get rid of the wealth tax, or his separatism bill that stigmatized minorities in France, especially French Muslim people. Or you could note some of his comments about Haitians being stupid. Or his infamous comment about how railway stations are where successful people and people who are nothing cross one another. And Macron even weighed in on trans issues when he criticized the left for proposing laws that let trans people change their identity at a town hall. You'd think he'd be more considerate of his trans parent/wife. Or maybe that's all a bogus conspiracy theory built on non-controversies like purchasing a weird rug. The real problems of Emmanuel Macron and the French government more broadly reach far beyond the narrow fantasies of Candace Owens. And if someone is genuinely interested in learning more about what's going on in France and the problems that might be facing the French people, look up some better criticism of Macron and his government and what they're actually doing, rather than these weird fantasies about Satanists trying to brainwash people through a weird opening ceremony at the Olympics. One of the stories that really helped Candace Owens' channel grow was the ongoing turmoil between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. The trouble between them swirls around difficulties while working on the movie It Ends With Us. Lively was facing some criticism online for supposedly doing a poor job promoting the movie, not taking its theme of domestic violence seriously enough. Towards the end of 2024, she filed a civil rights complaint against director and co-star Justin Baldoni for supposedly engaging in sexual harassment on the set of the movie and fomenting that online campaign against her. Afterwards, there was a flurry of lawsuits followed from both sides with lots of conflicting evidence. There has been a massive amount of speculation with different celebrities, PR firms, and other players being drawn in, and Candace Owens has been covering it exhaustively. Before diving into this story, I want to make something very clear. This controversy has so many fragments of information that I've personally been left not knowing who to trust about anything. I imagine this will all likely be settled in court in the future, so this bit of my video shouldn't be understood as supporting Blake Lively or Justin Baldoni. Rather, this is me talking about how this story has been exploited to push an agenda by Candace Owens. It's also important to be aware that the information that's been released so far has been released deliberately by one side or the other to support their claim. The fact that there is so many pieces of information and so much noise makes it a lot easier to fashion a narrative, even if that narrative isn't entirely based in fact. Not that Owens really seems to care about that. Her coverage boils down to assuming Lively is in the wrong about everything, and every piece of evidence will be framed to support that narrative. The reason this story fits into her messaging is because of how she first introduces it.
Blake Lively is not a good person. So no matter what happens in this lawsuit, no matter who wins in the end, do not let it distract you from the fact that she has proven herself not to be a kind person, okay? And that's largely due to the fact that she is a modern feminist.
The angle Owens has here is an anti-feminist one, and it's the lens through which she views this entire case, giving unlimited charity to one side and absolutely none to the other. I want to look at a brief example of how Candace Owens distorts the evidence of this story. There was a really great example of this back in January of 2025. This was about a piece of footage that was leaked that supposedly contradicted Blake Lively's initial complaint. I want to look specifically at how Candace Owens presented this. One of the contentions in Blake Lively's complaint was that during a dance scene, Justin Baldoni engaged in some inappropriate touching and said some things that made her feel uncomfortable. From here, we're shown a selection of the footage. This was made public by Baldoni's team. Owens doesn't show us every instance of Baldoni trying to initiate contact, though we can see in at least one instance that she does show us, Lively pulls away and suggests they talk rather than become more intimate. Before showing you Candace Owens' interpretation of all of this, I'm going to give you a brief rundown of how I read all of it. Looking at the complaint, we can see one inaccuracy as Lively didn't know sound was being recorded. The amended version of the complaint rephrases that to say she meant no sound was being recorded to be used in the movie, but obviously Owens couldn't know that. Perhaps Blake Lively simply didn't know any sound was being recorded. So that first sentence doesn't really matter too much. The final sentence happened sometime later, so that footage wouldn't speak to that one way or the other, so we'll put that aside for now. So let's look at this middle bit. The next sentence alleging that Baldoni wasn't speaking in character is true. You can hear in the audio that he's discussing his personal life as well as Blake Lively's. The part where he puts his lips on her ear and neck, and the part where he said, "It smells good," similarly were not included in the script. This is a brief moment that's only a few sentences long in the script, and you can see there's no mention of any specific physical contact. You could argue he's ad-libbing here, and he very clearly is, But the point of contention here is that this specific kind of ad-libbing was what made Lively feel uncomfortable. You could argue whether or not she truly felt uncomfortable in that moment because she was smiling and laughing along with it, but it seems logical to me that someone would try to smile their way through an uncomfortable situation and choose to discuss this later, rather than call out another actor, who's also the director, in the middle of the set with dozens of people watching. And Lively alleges she did that in the final line of the section. It's possible Blake Lively is lying in all of this, of course, but none of this seems beyond the pale to me. And since this is a complaint and not a lawsuit, it'd be premature to jump to any conclusion until you have all of the evidence. This footage, at best, complicates the original complaint, but doesn't outright debunk it. Now, you might be saying that I'm just a jerk on YouTube, so maybe my analysis of this footage isn't enough here. So I found a clip of an intimacy coordinator talking about what she sees in the footage.
Justin Baldoni's legal team says this clip is proof he did nothing wrong. Do you agree?
No, a director should convey that they want to see these characters kissing, or that they want to see, kissing on the neck beforehand. I think there absolutely should have been a conversation if that was how he wanted to shoot it.
But here's how Candace Owens analyzes this footage.
How are women allowed to do this, to take something and to make it sound like you survived a rape? Because that's what it sounded like to the public.
At no point did Blake Lively ever say she was raped. And based on the complaint, she doesn't even suggest it. Unless Candace Owens thinks that Blake Lively was trying to allege that Justin Baldoni raped her in the middle of a film shoot surrounded by dozens of people. A key piece of information that Candace Owens doesn't include is that this specific part of the complaint is from a section titled, "Mr. Baldoni ignored well-established industry protocols in filming intimate scenes and exploited the lack of controls on set to behave inappropriately." So this isn't about how she was sexually assaulted or anything like that, but rather Baldoni taking liberties with her body that violated industry standards. The standards in this case would be to have an intimacy coordinator on set to ensure everyone engaging in intimate acts would feel comfortable and at ease. So someone isn't just spontaneously trying to rub their lips on someone's neck, for instance. Candace Owens actually addresses the whole intimacy coordinator thing with an obvious lie.
Because he does say at one point, he's like, should we kiss? Should we just talk again? Because he is now the intimacy. They are the intimacy coordinators because she declined one, allegedly.
Blake Lively did not decline to have an intimacy coordinator. Candace Owens is referring to a series of text messages that the Baldoni team released that show Blake Lively declining to meet with the intimacy coordinator before production began on the movie. Someone declining to a meeting doesn't mean that they didn't reschedule it for later. And what is a verifiable fact is that once the movie began filming, an intimacy coordinator was used. If you look at the credits for the movie on IMDb, you can find 3 different people who appear in the credits with the title of intimacy coordinator. That Baldoni would attempt intimate contact as an ad lib without one of their intimacy coordinators being present, according to Lively's side, is actually pretty bad. But Candace Owens spins it like this.
By signing up to this film of them falling in love, presumably he maybe had her consent that they might touch. I don't know. This feels a little weird to me.
Actually, no. Starring in a movie does not imply that someone has consent to run their lips along your neck. Although Candace Owens says touch, because that sounds a lot more innocuous than what you can see in the footage. Blake Lively isn't objecting to all forms of touching, as she seems perfectly fine with the dancing, especially since dancing was in the script, and you can expect that someone's probably gonna have to touch you if there's a scene where there's dancing. What she's objecting to is that Baldoni put his lips on her, which seems like an obvious escalation, and one that was done without the appropriate intimacy coordinator being present. In other words, I think you can reasonably accuse Justin Baldoni of having ignored well-established industry protocols in filming intimate scenes and exploited the lack of controls on set to behave inappropriately. Again, I'm not saying I know any of this is a fact, but this isn't a lawsuit, it's a complaint. It's really hard to make a firm conclusion until you have access to all the evidence, which probably won't happen until this goes to trial. I'm sure this might be very frustrating for anyone who's been following this case because Lively has since amended her complaint to include additional information, and a million other new things have popped up since this video was first made public. But the main point I'm trying to make here is how Candace Owens is twisting facts to fit a narrative she's already decided upon, and that's Blake Lively is a terrible person, feminism is a danger, and when anyone is accusing a man of sexual harassment, they must be lying and doing it for some kind of ulterior motive. But worse than playing favorites, what's really stunning in her commentary is her ability to just make things up. Here's another example from a February 19th stream. In this clip, she's talking about how Blake Lively supposedly manipulated her co-star in the movie, Isabella Ferrer. First, she shows us the only clip we'll see of Ferrer describing their relationship.
I love her. She's the best. She's given me so much advice. She has been so generous to me. She has given me clothes. She's fed me. She's let me sleep over. I mean, she's just been like a big sister that I never had. I'm an only child, so I'm like, this is so nice.
After those few words, a minute later, Candace Owens has concocted an elaborate story.
But this sounds like a girly sleepover. This sounds like what I used to do with my friends that were the same age. When we'd go out, we'd have a good night, hanging out and be like, oh, we're just gonna all sleep over. We're gonna just have a big old sleepover, and you gossip. That's the purpose of sleepovers, okay? You gossip, you trade stories, you get close to one another, and all of that's fine. If Isabella Ferrer was doing this with another 23-year-old, I wouldn't have an issue with this. But it's not another 23-year-old, you guys. It's a 37-year-old woman inviting a 23-year-old colleague over for a sleepover. It's weird.
A comment about the relationship and having slept over her house once has now turned into some weird slumber party where they're exchanging clothes with one another. And she does this a lot. She takes a small piece of evidence and then extrapolates entire narratives. For example, at one point, Ryan Reynolds made a joke about an intimacy coordinator on one of Sandra Bullock's Instagram posts. Here's how Candace Owens described it on a January 27th stream.
Ryan is home and he's angry. This is me. Allegedly, don't sue me, okay? Do not sue me, Ryan Reynolds. I don't have time for your crap, okay?
This is part of a much larger narrative she's constructed where Ryan Reynolds is supposedly pulling the strings of all of this. The short version is that Reynolds went home during the strikes in Hollywood of 2023, saw some footage of Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni from the movie being intimate, was sent into a rage, and came up with this plot to take the movie away from him by creating this complaint where an intimacy coordinator is mentioned. And to signal that he was doing all this to Justin Baldoni, he made that comment on Sandra Bullock's Instagram post. This all sounds far more compelling coming from someone who seems utterly convinced that these disparate facts must be connected, ignoring how little substance there is here. But that's part of Candace Owens' presentation, threading together a series of facts that have no obvious connection, constructing a narrative based on conjecture, and then sticking to that narrative no matter what. Of course, the narrative she's sticking to is that Blake Lively is in the wrong. The actual facts surrounding Ryan Reynolds being enraged and taking control of everything changed a few weeks later when Blake Lively's complaint was amended to reveal that she was complaining about sexual harassment to the studio before the strike happened. So this plot, if it supposedly is a plot, would have had to have started well before Ryan Reynolds saw any kind of footage during the strike. But now suddenly the story is morphed, and Owens is talking about how Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds had been planning this from the very beginning, hence the whole bit about love bombing Isabella Ferrer. Of course, this was all in streams in January and February. By April, the narrative had morphed into how this is actually all a PR agency feud. I'm sure this narrative will change several times before this case goes to trial in March of 2025 as Candace Owens continued to read tea leaves and invent all sorts of theories about what's really happening. Speculating about this stuff is fine, but the problem here is that she's committed to a narrative, not the facts, and her commentary serves a specific agenda. Justin Baldoni is innocent of everything, and Blake Lively is evil, and by proxy, so is feminism. This isn't just tabloid gossip either. This is part of a larger political project.
These left-leaning TikTokers, I see you guys, I'm following all of you, who are begging me to only cover culture. Oh, we like you so much when you don't cover politics. People, it is all connected. It's the same thing. It's just put into a language that you can better understand.
That's what's most concerning about Candace Owens' coverage about this. While I'm personally not interested in this story at all, it's obviously very popular, and people who seek it out are getting more than an update on what's going on. They're not even getting the usual partisan reporting of siding with one celebrity over another. This is a conservative commentator using this story to advance an anti-feminist agenda. And if you stick around, she'll be happy to explain how a known predator isn't actually so bad. And to be clear, even if everything people are saying about Blake Lively is true and she's a horrible manipulator trying to use her clout to destroy Justin Baldoni, that wouldn't justify Owens' commentary that downplays sexual assault and runs cover for predators.
We have two different examples of men, one being Justin Baldoni, who is just so innocent, and one being Harvey, who definitely bears some blame because he wouldn't have been in that circumstance if he was not cheating on his wife, but who both share something that's really critical in common, which is that the media put a hit on them and were able to persuade the masses absent the facts which could have transformed things for him.
There's a stark difference between one movie star accusing a director of unwanted touching and a producer accused by over 100 women of sexual assault and harassment. The only thing they have in common are women claiming to have been harmed, and the fact that Candace Owens doesn't want anyone listening to them. Regardless of the facts of this case, it serves as an opportunity for Candace Owens to profit off a woman with a high profile who is being torn down publicly, whether it's the president of France's wife, the women who accused a powerful man in Hollywood, or a woman claiming she was harassed by her co-star. The goal is always the same, to discredit the women however she can and profit off that general animosity towards women. The channel Shanspeare has a great video about this phenomena that explores how stories of women not being perfect victims makes them the perfect target for those who make it their profession to tear women down in public. There is a deep appetite for stories like these, and when Candace Owens says she isn't being paid by Harvey Weinstein's team or anyone else associated with these figures, it's because she's taking advantage of the large audience that laps up stories just like these. For her, any story of a woman doing poorly is a business opportunity. And if it advances her political agenda, so much the better. And there's another update before this video goes live that I think I need to mention. Justin Baldoni's lawsuits against Blake Lively and the New York Times have both been dismissed, although it seems like his legal team will revise the lawsuits and try again in the future. This should, I hope, clarify that people like Candace Owens, who hyped up this lawsuit and were pretty emphatic about how the facts so utterly prove the case, should be taken with more than a grain of salt. Because when Candace Owens speaks about this, she's not reflecting any kind of legal expertise. Instead, she is displaying an ideological commitment to go after a powerful woman who is accusing a man of behaving inappropriately. One of the most viewed videos on Candace Owens' channel is an interview with Kevin Shipp titled, "Former CIA Officer Exposes the Shadow Government." Shipp is a bit of an odd guy as he claims to have all the dirty details about the sins of the CIA, and he's been speaking about it publicly for years now. Some of the facts around his story is that he stopped working for the CIA in late 2001, and he was the subject of a 2011 article in the New York Times where he was accusing the CIA of moving him and his family into unsafe living conditions, where they faced health problems because of mold contamination. Sometime later, his commentary got much more extreme, and the story about mold contamination became an attempt to murder him and his family, all because he discovered some kind of computer exploit and the CIA desperately needs him to be silenced, and apparently haven't been doing a good job because it's 24 years later and he still seems very much alive. Shipp is using his old job in the CIA as a form of currency to buy some credibility in circles ready to buy into his more outrageous stories. In his interview with Candace Owens, he does have plenty of stories about the CIA's dark history, but a lot of what he said has been in the public record for a while, and his personal story isn't terribly compelling. A good portion of the interview is spent on a series of long debunked talking points from other conspiracy theorists. Here's an easy one to disprove.
Where the CIA said, responding to the JFK assassination, we need to respond to the conspiracy theories that are out there about this shooting. And that's where the conspiracy theory label came from, was from that memo.
The term conspiracy theory was seen in print in the 19th century, decades before the CIA even existed. He drops other classics like questions about Tower 7 or how they recovered a passport from one of the 9/11 hijackers. And it's a reminder that conspiracy theories like these exist through a series of people plagiarizing from one another. And on the rare occasion they try to go out on a limb, they fall flat on their face.
Ace Lyons was commander of the Pacific Fleet back during that time. And I asked Ace Lyons about Pearl Harbor, and he goes, I am still angry to this day. And I said, why? He goes, because they knew the attack was coming. They knew where it was going to happen in Pearl Harbor and when. And they told no one, and they let it happen on purpose. That's from the commander of the Pacific Fleet. I would say that's a pretty credible witness.
James Ace Lyons was born in 1927, so he would have been 14 when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And no, he was not a fleet admiral at 14. You'll notice that through all these tall tales and obvious lies, Candace Owens just nods along and happily agrees with everything, because obviously that's the vibe she wants her audience to have towards her guest, to uncritically accept the things he's saying when much of it is obviously not true. In the midst of this nonsense, you get rare glimpses of worthwhile commentary, like how the US lied its way into the Iraq War, and generally mistrusting the CIA about everything is a good rule of thumb. But the problem with Candace Owens is the same problem with Alex Jones and other conspiracy theorists of their ilk. The good, when it makes a rare appearance, is lost in a sea of bad, and any critical engagement with the news or history is lost in an empty-headed contrarianism. There's no real value in rejecting mainstream news or history if you're going to uncritically replace it with garbage, and that's exactly what Candace Owens has done. She's built her channel on pop culture analysis that uses disparate facts to create a vibe. That vibe carries people into Christian nationalism and eventually into long discredited conspiracy theories. And to follow along the nonsense, it costs a mere $16.99 a month on her website, plus the cost of any books she might have put her name on. Oh, and there's merch you can buy too. And she's planning live shows. And eventually she might even find a way for you to donate blood directly to her. There's a lot of debate over whether or not someone is a grifter or just not very bright. And in many cases, it's probably a mix of both. But the important thing to keep in mind here is that all of this is simply not true, whether or not Candace Owens believes in it or if she actually doesn't. This is not a serious journalist presenting stories. This is someone presenting tired nonsense that is monetized to oblivion because they've learned they can make a very good living selling people these conspiracy theories. There are all sorts of little things I would have loved to include in this video, but I kind of didn't want to make it run too long, and they all demonstrate just how desperate some of this commentary is. I do think the selection of what I chose is a pretty good sampler of what it's like to watch a Candace Owens video, and it kind of blows my mind that so many people find this convincing when much of it is clearly nonsense. And part of me kind of hopes that these views are somehow being inflated or purchased, but I sincerely doubt that's the case. We like to tell ourselves that there aren't a ton of people willing to believe nonsense, but I think numbers like these are a stark reminder that some people are ready to believe anything. And there's some people who prefer more thoughtful entertainment on YouTube, like the fine folks you see with their names coming up on the screen now. If you would like to join them and get your name in the credits, early access to videos, and other fun bonuses every now and again, you can become a patron for the low price of $5 a month, or a member to this channel. You'll help me keep making videos like these and get some of those fun bonuses I talked about. If you would like to support the channel in a non-monetary fashion, you can like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, or share this video on social media. Big thanks to my friend Alice, who helped with some of the research and translation work for the Brigitte Macron section of this video. Thank you all so much for watching.